and who's gonna share some secrets about getting through a tech interview and successfully passing a tech interview. Let us welcome.
Hello everyone. So I guess you are not interested in the other session. First, let me start by thanking GDG DevFest. It's such an honor to be here. It's a very nice city and a very good crowd. I'm really impressed with the whole organization. Okay, this talk, let me start with the history of this talk. We gave this talk with a friend in Ankara in Android developer days, and it was a lot of fun. So Vitaly asked if I can do it alone without my friend because he needs to fly from United States. So I'll try to fill his gap. So let's start with the interview patterns. And I'm not really familiar with your culture, so how job interviews are done here. What I realized is the interviews in Turkey were really different than what you will face when you interview with Google or Facebook or such tech companies. So, as you might guess, I interviewed with almost all: Facebook, Google, Yelp, I think also Amazon, Intel. I failed some of them, not all, as you can guess since I'm working in Intel. And each time I failed, I start thinking about what I might be doing wrong. Then I had a friend who was working as a recruiter in Microsoft, who should be here too. And I start with asking him what I was doing wrong, or if he has any, if he can give some feedback, or tell me a secret sauce or a silver bullet. So we start about talking what he likes to hear, or what he likes to do when he is interviewing. And actually, he always ends up with one word. So I'll try to talk with you and ask questions. So let's do it interactive and try to see what he really wants to hear, how we can succeed in a job interview. So, why do we get hired by a company? Anyone? Any clues? Why would someone hire us?
Because they need us.
When we meet the requirements.
Yeah.
When you need professional.
Okay, it depends. Most of the time it's for the success of the project. So you're not hired because they want to make you happy. They hire you because they need someone who can lead the project to success. So it's not actually about you, it's about the company, it's about the project, it's about the team. So, then, when you apply for a job, you will be asked questions. So, let's start with some questions. For example, I like asking how you sort some data. If you were in an interview and if you were asked this, what would be the answer?
Depends on type of data.
It depends. Okay, you're an engineer, so you can't just make assumptions. You can't say, I didn't even say what's the data. It might be strings or characters, integers. It might be just a small range, like sorting integers of 0 and 1, something like binary. So it depends. The first question you need to ask is, it depends. So next, depends on what? What questions would you ask me?
Type.
Type, good.
Depends on data and expected result. And
Good. Count of data, the quantity. So let's assume I start with, I'll answer your questions. I want you to sort integers and a huge amount of integers, like a huge stream.
Random quicksort.
No more questions?
On the resources.
You are finished.
What can I use?
Sorry?
What can I use for this? Some cluster of computers, for example.
Good. You can ask a lot of questions. You can ask if you need to do it in place, if you have enough memory, because it's huge data, or you need to, if you can use some disk space, or you can just cache it into disk, then reload it. So the problem is you need to understand the problem, and you're an engineer, so you can't just make assumptions and just dive in. It's not like all engineering works like this. I mean, if you just ask someone to build a bridge, he will start asking you questions. What type of bridge? What's it going to be used for? Only cars or rail, or how the construction of the bridge depends on the length, so they might be using some other material. So you need to ask questions, you need to clarify everything, you can't leave any ambiguity. If there is something you're not sure, then you will just give a wrong answer. You can't just guess. So next, let me check my notes so I don't just skip anything. Oh, there was a good question Chris asked me that time. Okay, let me ask you that. How can I go to a grocery store?
To buy grocery store.
Sorry?
It depends where is store is.
Good.
Depends on place, from where.
Okay, from here to a grocery store.
Maybe it depends on what you do want to buy there.
That's a good question. I might be looking for some exotic,
And how much goods you want to buy there.
yeah. Also,
How
it,
much money do you have?
it depends on what time I'm going there, because there might be no parking space. Also, it depends if I'm going to buy huge amounts of fruits or other stuff, then it might be okay to drive somewhere far, because I'm buying a truckload of stuff and can go drive back. Sorry? Okay. So, it really depends on a lot of stuff. What are you going to do?
He can't read, don't worry.
So it's not me, I'm not funny. So, what you are going to buy, the amount, what time of the day, it depends on the traffic. There are a lot of stuff it depends on. So you can't just, I mean, if someone asks you to way to the grocery store, you will probably not ask those questions, but as an engineer, you need to ask. So you can't just say I can guess and dive into a job interview. So let me check. Okay. Then, if you have enough questions and if you just clear everything, you don't have any ambiguity, then the next phase is you need to have your test cases. You can't just start coding without thinking about the data which might be passed into your code. So a good question would be, let's start with a sorting problem. I asked you to sort the data. So what can be the input? Let's say I'll give you an array and give me some typical inputs.
File input.
No, let's say it's a typical integer array, but give me some values, like concrete data.
Random.
Oh, 5.
Yeah, it can be null, it can be an empty array. So first you need to create your test cases for a typical data, something like 4, 5, 6. What if the array is also already sorted? Would your code still work? What if it's sorted in the reverse order? You need to create all your test cases before you jump and think about an algorithm or start coding. So you need to list your test cases one by one. Let me just give you a tip. I once passed a phone interview just because I listed my test cases in the first place. Okay, I did deliver good code, but all they cared was I listed my test cases before I jumped into writing the code. So it will succeed. And it will really direct you to write better code because you will have all the edge cases. If you have enough test cases, you will have your edge cases, and you will have a clear understanding about the data, so you will write better code. Next, you need to work on the algorithm, and the best way to do is, okay, you can have two types of job interviews. One will be on phone, usually they are the first phases. Then the next level you will go on site and work on the whiteboard. So one thing you need to do is visualize your algorithm. It doesn't matter if you're doing it over the phone or on site. You need to use the tools to visualize. So on the phone, probably you will be using something like Google Docs or any online editing tool. So you can use any characters or symbols. You can create with the keyboard to just show how your algorithm would work. And the best way to do is just use your test cases and visualize what you're going to do. If you're iterating an array, just write the array and put an I or J or any pointer symbol below it and iterate it with the space. So you can just show what you're thinking to the recruiter. Because the interviewer wants to see how you think. He can't just understand if you memorized the code or if you really copy it from somewhere else if you just throw away all the code at once. You need to work in steps and show him that you're thinking in a good way to solve the problem and you have a clear understanding about the situation and you have some algorithm to solve the problem. So one good thing is if you have the opportunity to use the whiteboard, you can always draw anything you like. But if you are using the online editing tools, then you need to be more creative. So one good way is, if you're going to have a job interview, you need to practice on the tools which you will perform. So if you're going to have a phone interview, just write code on Google Docs or any other online document, but not with your IDE, not to paper, because on paper you can draw, on the text editor you can't. So you need to visualize, you need to write your test cases, you need to practice those stuff on an online editor. And when it comes to whiteboard, it's you might suck more than you can imagine, because we don't usually use whiteboard in our daily lives for coding, right? Anyone? First write their code on whiteboards, then use the IDE. Okay.
At least algorithm.
Yeah, algorithm might be, but still, it's funny because when a candidate gets in and starts coding, you realize they just use the whiteboard, they start writing in the middle, and they don't make use of the space. So I tend to give a larger board. And the funny thing is, when you give the candidate a larger board, they start writing larger. Still fill the same space. So what I like to do is, I always have my marker, the whiteboard marker with me. So if the whiteboard marker they gave me is something thick, I can always use mine. I might even have one in my bag. So have your own marker and buy something which is fine, so you can write. It will suddenly make the resolution of the whiteboard HD, because you can write smaller. And you need to make use of the space. Let me check. Okay, I have time. You need to make use of the space. So there is one good pattern which Chris taught me. It's called the whiteboard development environment. So what we do is first, just like an IDE, just divide the whiteboard into pieces. Leave yourself a huge place for coding, but on some part you need to write your test cases, and always write the question at the top, because you can't believe this, but if someone asks you a question and if you start thinking about it, you may change the question by the time you got an answer. So you might be replying a question which is not asked. So always the first thing you need to do is write the question. And also it's a good idea to note down the questions you asked and the answers you get. So anything you ask for, it depends, you need to, it's always good to write it on board, and always you can just go back and say to the recruiter, he answered it that way, and if there's a conflict in the questions or answers. So, the part I'm going to skip is writing the code, because if you practice enough and if you had your test cases, you will probably find a good algorithm to solve the question. If you can't, then, well, there's no silver bullet for this. You can't just have a magic wand and get that job. So if you're not strong with the algorithms or interview type questions, just go practice. There are a lot of practice questions on YouTube or career sites. But after writing your code, there's one important thing. Always test your code. Debug and test the code you have written. This is also something nice, and another interview I succeeded. I'm pretty sure they also liked the code, but what they liked most was me debugging my code line by line. So to do that, what I do is I create my memory stack. So you won't have an IDE when you're on whiteboard. So just who here uses Eclipse? No? Eclipse? Any other IDE? IntelliJ? Okay, Xcode? Good. So all those IDEs have some small window which shows the values of the variables and basically what you have in the memory. So you need to just mimic this on the whiteboard to track the differences, the changes on the variables or values, or you may just realize you're doing something wrong. And I have what I can say is I really failed to write some good code on some interviews, but by the time I prepared my stack on the whiteboard and start debugging, I realized I'm doing something wrong. And you may not believe this, but usually when interviewers don't expect you to write perfect code, they're fine with errors. You can make mistakes and just miss some edge cases. But if you debug and find your error, it's much better than writing solid code at once. Because everyone will make mistakes when they code in their daily lives. But if you can find your mistake on your own, it's a good skill. And if you can show it in the interview, that's something they like. And once I had such an error, and I just realized the code is not working when I debugged with my test cases. And the interviewer was pretty happy. He was saying, okay, you find your own error, it doesn't really matter, and we can just fix it with one if condition. And I succeeded that interview, although the mistake was something simple. I mean, I shouldn't be doing it in the first place. So the you should just create a memory stack and follow each variable, each change, line by line. So what I do is just get the marker, go to your code, and just run as if you are you're on a computer, line by line. Just don't just skip a line and assume, okay, I won't be. I can just dive into the main loop, or I can just go back to the real code. Just try to run each line and see if it changes or if it creates any side effects. So I have some, let's say, best practices for coding. Let me sum stuff with those. So when I start coding, if you ask the questions, if you prepare the test cases, and if you are willing to debug your code when it's done, you're almost good to go. So these are the rest will be just up to you if you're already practiced enough and know the basic algorithms and stuff. So, and to write the cleaner code, there are some patterns you can follow. One, the best thing would be first asking the method signature, because it's already, if you're going to solve a problem, even without the test cases or the algorithm, there's an input and output, so it's already defined. So ask about the method signature and just put the input, output, and just make it clear. Next, each function or method needs to check its input. You can't assume if you're asked to sort integers, you can't assume the array will not follow, or there will be an array. It might be just an empty one. Or you can't even assume numbers will be positive or negative, or they can't be even numbers. There might be some other data which is passed to you. So, sorry?
Characters, for example.
Yeah. So you need to check all the conditions on the data to see if it's valid and if it will not break your code. Then you will realize you missed one question. What's the error case? Your function may not work because the data is not valid. So what should you do? Do you need to throw an exception or return a specific value like -1? So actually this also depends on who is going to use the code. What are they going to do with this code? Or because if you are writing an API, and if it's a small company, and if everyone can just talk to each other and know what your code is doing, then you can just decide on a specific value for error. Like, okay, if I'm returning -1, then this means this is an error case for this function. But if you're really releasing it on GitHub and make it a public API or library, then you can't just give a specific number and assume everyone will understand that it's an error case. So you really need to decide on which conditions would be a better fit for throwing an exception, or just returning null, or just returning a specific value. So that was another ambiguity, and most of the time we all forgot about asking the error condition. So after checking the input, you need to create your variables which you're going to use in the function. So what I do is to not forget those steps. Whenever I start coding, I just put some comments to remember, to make sure I'm not leaving the path, and I remember everything to put everything in the code. So the first command would be check input. The second one would be one-off checks, which are like if you are going to sort some array, and if it's only one element, it's already sorted. So you can check if it is null or empty, but you should also check if it is already sorted, like one element. So these are one-off checks, and you can really cut the. You can always have a shortcut and return a value if the input doesn't really need to take some space in take time in running your code. So next, you initialize your variables. So I put an init variables command to just create everything there. Then you move to the main loop. So what a good pattern is, when you visualize your algorithm to the interviewer, go back to the main loop section and write your algorithm as a pseudocode in commands. If you're on the whiteboard, you can just leave some space where you can just write the actual code. If you're writing some pseudocode, always make the interviewer know you will move to the actual code, because even when I interview with a candidate, I don't really like them just write pseudocode and don't really want to write actual code. So just make sure you will he or she understands that you will move and write actual code, and you're just now working on the pseudocode. So basically the coding part is, I have no more to add on the coding part, because it's almost straightforward as long as you're prepared enough. So when you're done, unless the interviewer doesn't want you to test your code, which maybe only once they asked me to not test it, because they said, okay, it's solid enough and it will work, we don't need to test. Always test your code, and to start testing, go back to your test cases, run each one by one and line by line to see your code is working and you're getting the results expected. If you had any mistakes, just go back and fix the algorithm. And when it comes to fixing, it's not like fixing the code in your IDE. So you may need to rewrite some sections. Just don't put something to fix that condition. Like if you're just like returning -1, value -1 or value +1. You need to fix it in a good way because the interviewer wants to see a good code from you. So they won't just be happy with the temporary fix over there. That will upset the interviewer and you will probably lose points and fail that interview. So finally, how the interview process works, I can't talk specifically for one company, but most of the time you will have 1 or 2 phone screens. And for those phone screens, as I mentioned before, you will need to use Google Docs or any other online editing tool. Next, on-site, again, it depends on the company, but you will have 4 or 5 interviews. Most of the companies have one open-ended discussion question, but the rest will be whiteboard coding. So you need to practice coding on whiteboard. That's not, as we talked before, that's not something we do regularly, daily. So, one thing. So be sure you have a whiteboard. What I did was I bought a small whiteboard. So the smaller whiteboard you get, the better and more organized you will become. So buy a small one. You don't need a lot of space. And just find a fine marker and learn to make use of the space on the whiteboard because that would be the only asset you will have in the interview. And you can't just start in the middle and write in very big letters, then wipe it and go back and write some more code again. You can't do that. So you really need to learn how to make use of the whiteboard. So I think that's it. I really need to rewind back and emphasize the it depends part because most of the interviews will finish in the mind of the interviewer if you don't ask enough questions. So prepare your questions, think about the problem, think about the ambiguity you don't know. You don't need to have any, it doesn't need to be a coding question, an algorithm question. You can find a lot of ambiguity even like the grocery example. You need to make everything clear. You need to be an engineer because you are one and the position you're applying needs those skills. No one will want to hire you if it doesn't really matter if you're really smart. You can't make assumptions because assumptions are nothing to do with smartness. It's just gambling. You're just let me tell you a story how we started the talk with Chris. I had interviewed with a company and the question was I was given 2 linked lists and linked lists had integers and they wanted me to return a new one which sums the 2 linked lists. So think the linked lists as digits. So the first digit, the second one, the third one, and I'll add 2 linked lists and create a new one and return. It's simple, right? We can just work on an algorithm in 15 or 20 minutes to return the value. I failed. So I was really curious because I didn't know how, I mean, I can't really do it better because it's it's something similar. I mean, simple. You can just iterate each linked list one by one, add the items. If there's a carryover, keep it in a variable and carry it to the next digit. Any problem with the question? When I called Chris and told him, okay, I was asked this, the first thing he told me was, what base was the numbers? Okay, it was 10. Did you ask? No, but it was 10, right? So, you can't do that. I mean, okay, the decimal, most of the mathematical operations are done on the base 10, but you can't just do such an assumption. If we are working together as developers, and if I know you will make such assumptions, I wouldn't be really confident about using your code, right? So that was how we start talking about those stuff with Chris, and in the end, you will see the more questions you ask, sometimes the interviewer doesn't always have a solid question or a solid type of data in their mind. So the more questions you ask, you can even simplify the question you were asked. Like if you ask about the range of the numbers and the interviewer says it's like between 1 to 100, then you can just use bucket sort and just put each count the numbers, and you don't even need to sort, and you can really shrink a huge amount of data into 100 size array. So most of the time the interviewer doesn't really think of such a solution. But if you ask the right questions, from the answers you got, you can even perform much better than he was expecting. So you can even overrule his best answer, because if you can just count the, if you can, let's say, if you're sorting numbers from 1 to 100, you can just create the array and start counting each index. Then you can do the sorting in ON, and the memory footprint will be much less smaller than the whole original data. But in that case, you need to ask if you can really, if you don't need to keep the original data. So that's almost it. The tricky part is finding the right questions, asking the right questions enough, and just make sure there's no ambiguity, and then start coding with those answers you received. Let me stop here, and if you have any questions, I'd like to see if I can answer. No questions? Okay, thanks.